Good morning, everyone. If we could get situated. Good morning again, and welcome to the meeting of the Federal State Joint Board on Judicial Separations. Jurisdictional separations. Might be judicial, too. I want to thank my federal and state colleagues for their participation. You may note that some of them may be attending remotely. Do we have the phone situated? We'll work on that, but I want to welcome in person Vice Chairman Colbeck, Steve. Thanks, and his son is making sure that we behave here this morning. Want to welcome you too, and I also want to thank the panelists for participating and our federal and state staffs for the coordination and planning of this meeting. And let me thank my staff member Angie Cronenberg for all of her work on all of the joint boards. She is very tired of me, but she doesn't complain in my face. We have a significant agenda ahead of us today, so we're going to skip opening comments, statements from the commissioners, if you don't mind, Mr. Vice Chairman. However, let me briefly explain the process for this meeting before we get started. Each panelist will have about 3 minutes, or up to 3 minutes, to give his or her presentation. Then our federal and state staff leads, led by Daniel Ball and Joel Schiffman, will take turns asking the panelists to answer questions our federal and state staffs have compiled based upon a written record of the issues before us. At any time during this segment, if the commissioners have a follow-up question, they will be recognized. After the agreed-upon questions are completed, if time permits, commissioners may ask additional questions. At 10:30, you may be happy to know we'll take about a 15-minute break. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started with the opening presentations. But before, please introduce yourselves and identify the entity that you represent. And let's start with Roger.
I'm Roger Nishi, and I'm from Waitsfield and Champlain Valley Telecom, and I'm here today on behalf of the associations and NECA.
Richard.
Richard Askoff. I'm the Executive Director of Regulatory with the National Exchange Carrier Association, and I'm with Roger.
I'm Ken Burchett with GV&W, a consulting firm to rural telephone companies, and we're from Portland, Oregon.
Jeff Smith with GV&W Consulting.
I'm Mike Scriven with Fairpoint Communications.
And Tim Boucher with Quest Communications.
Charlie Ackworth, National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates.
Susan Baldwin, I'm a consultant here today on behalf of Masuka and the New Jersey Division of Rate Counsel.
We also have participating by phone Eric Van Wambeke from the California Public Utilities Commission.
Yeah, I'm here.
Great, and I heard a couple of more beeps. Anyone else online?
Madam Chair, it's Tom Pugh from Minnesota.
Welcome, Commissioner. Mr. Chair.
Christopher White from the Jersey Division of Rate Counsel.
More beeps. Anyone? Was there another voice that I could not hear just now?
Chris White from the Jersey Division of Rate Counsel.
Thank you.
George Young from the Vermont Service Board.
Rolane Weiss from the South Dakota Commission.
Peter Pescasalo from Connecticut DPUC.
Well, thank you. Thank you for participating online, especially those who might not be on this side of the time zone, might be in a different time zone, and want to acknowledge the presence of Commissioner Michael Cobbs and Commissioner Meredith Baker. Thank you so much. We dispense with opening comments, and so we're going to get right in, if you don't mind.
Works for me.
Okay. And so at this point, I think Angie.
We're starting with the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates.
Okay. Nasuka, you're up. Susan.
Thank you for this opportunity to participate today.
And beauty before age.
And Charlie is here with me, and Chris White from New Jersey Rate Counsel, who you just heard is participating by phone. And I do have some PowerPoints. I obviously can't go through them all. So recognizing that even if I went at breakneck speed, I couldn't get through them all, let me just pause a moment to set forth 3 key points that I would like you to take back with you. First, let me define the problem. As I see it, the current separations process is unfair, economically inefficient, harms consumers, and fails to accurately depict the costs, revenues, and usage of today's network, but instead corresponds with networks of 10 to 15 years ago. The three Bell operating companies earn as much as $13 billion a year from DSL services, yet they don't pay a fair share of the local loop that the DSL requires to be offered. Demand for interstate special access services has grown so much since the 2001 freeze that state members estimate that 21% of the plant should be directly assigned to the interstate jurisdiction rather than 10%. Also, it's entirely unclear how carriers are divvying up revenues from their bundled offerings. The solution to this problem, the FCC should adopt the state members' proposal no later than June 30th of 2011, and should also reinstate ARMA's reporting requirements. The third point, the impact for the consumer. Without separations reform, carriers are reporting misleadingly low state earnings, which handicap state regulators. They rely on these purported under-earnings at the state level for failure to invest sufficiently in local networks, and they set rates that are too high. The state members' proposal is entirely consistent with a very detailed filing that NSUCA submitted in 2006. We did some back-of-the-envelope calculations. I'm not obviously going to stop at all these slides, but you do have a handout with you that has detail to support the points that I'm making about revenues and changing networks. I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation only on one correction, that is shifting a fair share of the local loop to new services. I have to emphasize back of the envelope, it was my rough implementation of the state members' proposal and consistent with methodology that I supported in my affidavit in 2006. And what I end up with is shifting so that the allocation to the state is 65%, not 75% of the local loop. I did back-of-the-envelope calculations. So what would that do? If state regulators were faced with more accurate depictions of state earnings, what would the results be? That's what this handout up on the screen shows, and that's partially corrected. What if we were to fully correct state earnings? We would need to shift and directly assign more common plant to reflect increasing use of interstate special access. That's not happening because of the freeze. Again, that's harming consumers. What else would we need to do? We need to look at bundles. Are states getting a fair share of the bundles? Is anybody looking at that? What else might happen? Obviously, if a state did a traditional rate of return regulation, they'd look at depreciation, marketing, lobbying, overhead, and so on. But I've been a witness in proceedings where I've heard that states, shucks, they're not earning enough money, they can't possibly repair outside plant. Sorry about all those complaints in Western Massachusetts, but we're under-earning. Well, what if states had accurate ARMAS data? What if separations were done accurately? And there's lots of detail here. I hope that if you have questions, I'd be happy to go into it in more detail. Again, I would urge you to recommend to the FCC, and I would urge the FCC to approve the state members' proposal on an interim basis, not wait for intercarrier compensation reform and special access and USF.
Thank you, Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Boucher.
Vice Chair Colbeck and distinguished members of the board. I'm Tim Boucher, again, Associate General Counsel for Quest, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you this morning about jurisdictional separations. Sure. Sorry about that.
And sorry about, we've got a lawmaker, so I'm sorry I was a bit Boucher. I apologize.
Boucher, oh, no problem. Again, Tim Boucher with Quest, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you this morning. In this short presentation, I just want to make a couple of points. First, to summarize Quest's position. In Quest's view, the separations freeze continues to be the right answer when it comes to separations and continues to strike the right policy balance at this time. All the reasons to implement a freeze from 9 years ago still exist, and indeed, if anything, given the Commission's commitment and the National Broadband Plan call to reform intercarrier comp and USF now, and the potential negative impact for separations reform reform on broadband, those reasons are even greater today. Just want to talk about a couple of important contextual points this morning. The first is the limited purpose of the separations rule. Some of this is obvious, but I think it's helpful to kind of set the table this morning. Separations rules were obviously necessary because under rate of return regulation, cost allocation was necessary. However, to the extent a carrier is not under a rate of return or cost-based regulation, then cost allocation becomes unnecessary as cost has no impact on prices. The second contextual point I'd like to emphasize is the limited shelf life of separations rules. Again, they were a tool of rate of return regulation, and as such, as we move more and more towards competition and less regulation, ultimately will become unnecessary. But so long as some carrier somewhere is subject to rate of return regulation or some kind of cost-based regulation, it will be necessary. So to a large extent, the question really is how to manage separations in the interim. The third contextual point I'd like to just emphasize is the limited function of separations rules. Again, separations rules, like the overall regulatory umbrella that they serve, reflect a host of policy choices and political compromises over the years and are a results-driven reflection of those. And as such, all allocation rules really are arbitrary in a sense. From an economic standpoint, there isn't an accurate way to allocate costs and not a correct answer. So again, to conclude, Quest's position is that the best solution for separations at this time is to continue the freeze until intercarrier comp and USF reform is accomplished. If not, then otherwise separations reform will distract from that important work. We'll put the cart before the horse because we don't know what to do in separations until we know what USF reform and intercarrier comp reform will look like. We'll increase compliance burdens. And again, fundamentally, any interim form has inherent flaws in that it's a tinkering with a flawed system, reflects an erroneous premise that there is a correct answer, and threatens to make matters worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher. Now I would recognize the California PUC.
Hello, this is Eric Van Wombeck from the California PUC. I'm going to keep mine pretty brief, and as I'm sure some of you know, we joined or ended up participating in this much later. So just a few words from us. Our main concern here is that we feel the FCC must align costs with revenues to better reflect how the network is used. And I think that's our fundamental principle when we look at all potential changes to how separations are, or how separations will be changed in the future. Secondly, the loop is now used in a much different way than it was in the past, so separations no longer represents how the loop is used. The freeze on separations must end, but separations must remain flexible. And this has been spoken to already by a few of the panelists, is that a rigid separation structure will not survive. It will not be appropriate now or in the future, and there must be one that is flexible, that changes with technology changes and changes in the market. And then last is separations is not only used to allocate costs, it's also used by states and the federal government to allocate or to derive billing bases for universal service and other funding sources. So the talk here should not be limited to only the cost allocations, but those separations factors are also used for other means, not just limited to costs. And that's it.
Thank you, California. And now, Fairpoint.
Thank you. I'm Mike Scriven with Fairpoint Communications, and just a little bit about Fairpoint. Fairpoint operates 31 ILECs in 18 states. That includes three of those ILEC operations are the former Verizon operations that we acquired in March of 2008 in the states of Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire. And just to put that into context, based on looking at the access line counts at the time we acquired it, we acquired about 1% of Verizon's ILEC operations. So that'll give you an idea of the relative sizes. We also generally are here representing what's referred to as non-forbearance price cap carriers, in that there's a number of mid-sized carriers, including Fairpoint, who have not received forbearance from cost allocations, but do operate under federal price cap operations. So, due to the limited time, fortunately I put my conclusions up front, and then as I run out of time, then we can look at those later. But for price cap carriers, for Fairpoint, separations is arbitrary. And so changes to separations would also be arbitrary. The permanent separations reform, in my opinion, should only include what may be legally required to implement comprehensive reform of intercarrier compensation and universal service. And for Fairpoint, interim separations reform, which could move costs in either direction, would be potentially destabilizing for us and other affected carriers. The purpose of separations has been well described by Tim, so I won't go into that. The relevance of separations reform is that if we were in an environment dealing with the provision of state and interstate telecommunication services by monopoly firms, then separations reform might have meaning and purpose. However, we're in a competitive environment where rates are not based on costs, but are based on market factors. The allocation of common costs is arbitrary. Tim mentioned that. No economic theory provides guidance as to how you allocate common costs among services. And quoting from a 2005 FCC docket, we conclude that as more services are offered over a single loop, cost allocations are likely to become more arbitrary and thus less reasonable. And if you look at the at our infrastructure, the vast majority of telecommunication costs are common, and therefore the allocation between jurisdictions is arbitrary. So the last thing I'll say here is that there is one principle that we can all agree upon, and that is that with respect to the allocation of common costs, the other person ought to pay for all of them.
Thank you. Now I recognize GBNW.
Thank you, Chair Clyburn, Vice Chair Colbeck, Commissioners and staff. We appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today. Ken Burchett's going to share some specific points with respect to the state member's proposal, and then I'll offer some additional statements on policy issues. Ken?
With regard to the first proposal that the state members made, in essence to subcategorize Category 1 investment, we are not opposed to the option of using a revenue base as an alternative, as long as the current method that's prescribed in the rules of using cost per loop and using current loops remains in place for those that choose to use it. The second proposal, however, to put in new categories for Category 1.3 investment, we oppose that in its current form because it does not accomplish for the high-cost companies what the state members were trying to accomplish, that being shifting cost to the interstate jurisdiction. It actually works opposite for companies with high loop costs, over 175% of the national average. So until certain items are addressed, such as the impact on USF and policy issues regarding where the additional interstate cost is going to go, is it going to go to special access or to common line? So at this point, we're open to discussions on what policies should be achieved and where the costs get assigned, but we're opposed to it in its current form.
In terms of responding to some of the questions that have been posed that we'll use for the balance of the session, perhaps the simplest way to express our policy view on this is that separations of reform should occur both before, during, and after the reform of universal service and intercarrier compensation. I'm sure we'll get into some specifics when we get asked the questions, but we believe there are some issues that really predate even the state members' proposal in terms of the before that are necessary to reduce some of the administrative costs associated with arguments about interpretation on the current rules and allocations. We believe it's important to look at it during the process to make sure that the desired policy goals can be achieved while allowing carriers under rate of return their constitutional right for an opportunity to recover those costs. We recognize that's a significant challenge given the wide variety of circumstances and areas that companies serve. If we took the density of Alaska and placed that into New York, there'd be 14 people living in Manhattan. So we've got some wide varieties of service areas in the country to craft rules for. And we think it'll be important to deal with it after the fact because there will likely be some issues that come up that will need fixed after the other reforms are finalized. We look forward to the Q&A session on the balance.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. And NECA?
Thank you, commissioners, staff. We appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. I'm going to cede most of my time to Roger. I just wanted to point out that the National Exchange Carrier Association filed comments in this matter along with OPASCO. Roger is a past chairman of OPASCO. Also with the National Telecommunications Telecommunications Cooperative Association, NTCA, the Eastern Rural Telecom Association, and the Western Telecommunications Alliance. So our views here, we're really here representing all of those rural associations, which collectively represent the views essentially of over 1,000 small telephone companies across the country, which could potentially be affected by changes in the separations rules. So I'm fortunate that Roger was able to join me this morning. He is someone that actually helps operate a small telephone company and can explain how these proposed changes might impact the in the real world here.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be here before you today. Okay, 3 points. There's no slides from me, but the 3 points you can write down. We do categorize things today and allocate our investments based on how they are actually used. The vast majority of rate of return companies that are NECA members still continue to do categorization studies, count their loops, and allocate the loop investment based on those counts. So at this point in time, we don't see a need for any changes within the process. At the same time, there are some companies who did freeze their allocations, not their allocations, but their investment studies. They at various times have requested the opportunity to unfreeze, do a new categorization study, and then refreeze. I think that would be helpful for those companies that request that. So that's point number one. Point number two is adoption. Let's take a look at this from the point of view of rates and the prices. If we allocate more to the interstate jurisdiction, as said in the association's comments, that will increase the amount of investment going to our DSL services. Rates upwards of $28 on a wholesale basis to close to $100. That will harm adoption, and and that's the whole goal we have out there today, is to get customers on the network and to use our network. Third point, there's a lot going on now. National Broadband Plan could take all of our time. I see no way that we can really come up with an interim process and have all the companies adopt it, and at the same time try to figure out a transition plan to what's going to come about in National Broadband Plan. I don't know how you'll have time to do that. I don't know how us as companies will have time to do that. So that being said, I think it's one where, well, coming back to the investment portion, which I really want to hit on. Anytime there are changes, it leads to uncertainties. And when there are uncertainties, we sit back as companies and say, can we do this investment? Will we be able to return on this investment? So anything that happens now could stall broadband investment also. With that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. And now I would recognize our staff for questions. Joe? If you could speak into the mic, we appreciate it.
I'll open this to anyone who wants to try and answer it. If we don't do
separations reform, and we need to.
This is Eric. We
How
can't hear
should we-
you.
Joel,
on the phone.
if you could use your outside voice, we'd appreciate it.
Okay.
Daniel, please help Joel with the mic.
Okay, fine. If the conclusion is that we do need separations reform, how can we properly allocate costs without implementing it?
Let me see if I understand your question, Joel. You're saying if we implement it, how can we allocate? Could you repeat that?
No, if we need separations reform because the existing process is not working, how can we allocate costs without implementing reform?
Can I take a stab at it?
Sure.
Do we need separations reform, and if not, how would we properly allocate costs?
We definitely need separations reform, and I think we've heard many reasons for delay, but none of them are sufficiently persuasive to offset the harm that's being done to consumers today. And I know there's been so the way that we would do it is to implement the state member's proposal in a timely manner. We've had 9 years of freeze, so I may be missing the significance of your question there, though.
Roger, you seem to disagree. If I'm to capture what you stated very succinctly, is you're saying that you're already doing that, and the disconnect that Susan is describing is not being, am I miscategorizing what I'm hearing from you? I thought that's what I heard you say, Mr. Nish.
No, we are under a different form of regulation when it does come to this.
Okay, so now tee up Mr. Smith then. I'm sorry, Mr.
To clarify that, if I understand this correctly, there are really two parts to the state member's proposal. Part one primarily affects companies that have frozen categorizations. If I remember correctly, that was mandatory for the price cap companies and optional for rate of return companies. At the beginning of that, about, I think, 80 or so rate of return companies elected to freeze their categorizations. In the intervening years, I think more than half of them have converted to price caps. So among the universe of rate of return companies, there are probably only about 40 or less that have frozen categorizations. So that first part of the proposal would just affect them. And some of them, as Roger pointed out, have asked for the option to unfreeze those categorizations and then refreeze them again. So on that first part, I think most of the rate of return companies are not really that deeply affected by it, so it's not an issue. The second part of the proposal would, however, affect all of the rate of return companies, and quite significantly. It would add quite a bit of additional work and analysis, and it would have the impacts on the DSL rates that Roger was describing earlier. So, is it?
Susan, did you have a response to that?
I would want to see the backup for the $28 to $100. I think that consumers, consumer advocates, and regulators need access to the data to which carriers refer. We're talking about $13 billion in revenues. To see an increase justified to $100, I would be interested in seeing the underlying cost studies. Again, we have to understand DSL costs and revenues are not now being looked at by anybody, and that's why the state member's proposal is so important. There's $13 billion that go on the carrier's ledger that has nothing to do, and I understand that this is a separations board, but part of the solution needs to be a Part 64 solution, which is those costs shouldn't be showing up as regulated at all. If we want to regulate broadband, I've been for it from the very beginning, but if we're not going to regulate broadband, it's entirely unfair to consumers that the carriers get the revenues and the consumers get the costs. So that's a two-part answer. I want to see the studies for the $100 costs, price estimate for broadband, and how would you sustain that in a competitive market. And second, we're talking about a service that, again, I don't agree with this at all, but a service that's not deemed regulated. So if the revenues are not regulated, let's just make sure that service gets a fair share of the cost. So I support the disaggregation, additional categories under the cable and wire facilities of state member proposal. It's incredibly important. The industry can make it sound incredibly complicated. Let's not be persuaded by that position.
Well, let me ask you this. Would access to the data be enough without reform?
No, we need reform because, again, consumers are hurt in state proceedings. When carriers are told to lower their switched access charges, they say, oh, gosh, we need to raise basic local because we need to be made whole. When carriers are requested, can you possibly improve your outside plant? Shucks, we can't. We're under earning. So that would not be true, and in fact is not true if costs were properly allocated. We need implementation, not more data, not more studies. We need implementation of what has been put on the table, a very reasonable proposal by state members. And people can throw darts in it and find all kinds of problems with it, but earlier someone said, nothing's perfect. I agree, but something can be a little bit less imperfect than we have now today.
Thanks, Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Smith, Mr. Boucher?
If there is going to be reform at some point in time, it would be important to know what the jurisdictional shifts are going to be before we do some of the other changes that are being proposed. Because if we get to the end of the process and have developed a solution set for the wrong either inter or intrastate amount, then we're going to have to redo a lot of work because carriers are entitled, at least the rate of return carriers, and Roger and Rick correctly pointed out that there are two forms of regulation here, and the bulk of the slides that Nasuka had deal with some of the price cap issues. So from a rate of return perspective, we'd simply like to know what the target is, and if there are going to be some changes, we need to be able to have time to develop strategies to meet those policy goals.
I wanted to make a little bit of a clarification regarding what happens to the DSL cost once it gets over to interstate. There seems to be an assumption that on a joint loop, if we start taking some of that and allocating more of it over to interstate, that it will go to the DSL or special access service. Under the current rules, the common line in the wideband order, the FCC determined that the DSL, along with the SLIC charge, well, the DSL would, in essence, ride the loop for free because all of the cost associated with interstate was being picked up by the SLIC charge. So what happens in the study is that loop that contains both local and DSL service is assigned to common line. It gets the 25% allocator. It's part of the universal service mechanism. But when it gets over to Part 69, it is not assigned to DSL. It is assigned to local. So what hasn't been addressed is if you recategorize the 1.3 and create new categories, it's not clear how the FCC will treat those new categories. Will they try to put it to DSL, increasing the DSL cost, or will they continue to put it with joint cost as they are now in the common line element?
Thank you. Assuming for this question that the Commission has decided to implement interim reform of the separations process, how should the Commission go about it?
This is Mike Scriven with Fairpoint. Fairpoint has both price cap operations and rate of return operations. So we have a perspective on this that may differ from a lot of other companies. I also want to clarify one statement that was made earlier. There's actually not 3 box. There's 4. Fairpoint Communications was designated as a Bell operating company when it was formed in 2008. So. I'm not saying we're in the same category as the 3 major BOCs, but technically we are a BOC. With respect to separations reform, as I've said, it simply doesn't make sense for companies operating under price cap. And we'll talk later in more detail, I'm sure, about broadband. But essentially, the Commission has established policies over the year to encourage and provide incentives for incumbent LECs to provide DSL services, recognizing that the primary competitors to ILEX for DSL services are the cable companies, and that they control a majority of the market, and they still do. It was found in the wideband order basically that it was in the public interest for the ILEX to have incentives to be able to do that. On a continuing basis, as we and all other local exchange carriers are trying to push the broadband services out into areas which are certainly marginally economic, if not completely uneconomic, any incentives that are, or I should say any disincentives that are put on us with respect to DSL, I think would interfere with our motivation and incentives to go out and serve those areas. So I think we need to stay the course on that. With respect to separations reform for rate of return carriers, and with respect to the freeze option, which has been mentioned, Fairpoint Communications recently converted a small subset of its rate of return regulated study areas to price cap regulation for interstate purposes, and we're looking at the rest of them to see if that makes sense. And it would make a lot of sense for us to be able to have an option to freeze the categories when that happens. And so we're certainly supporting the option that rate of return carriers would be able to change their election on the freeze, particularly if they're converting to price cap regulation for interstate purposes.
If the joint board and the commission were to determine, Roger made a point earlier whether there was time to do so, but if a determination was made that there was time to take on this issue, we would anticipate that the process would be to evaluate current policy goals, and then the Federal Commission would work with the state commissions and the industry in developing workable solutions, and we would anticipate that would probably involve a comment and a reply process with a fairly data-intensive analysis required to reach a suitable public policy goal.
If I could just address that second question, I guess starting with Quest's response to the first question as to whether reform is needed, emphatically no. Quest would say the system is working effectively for the few carriers who continue to be a subject or need cost allocation. You've heard in detail some of the reasons for that from some other members of the panel. With respect to the second question, again, from Quest's perspective, when we talk about any kind of interim reform, it is because of numerous problems with undertaking interim reform. Any proposal is not a good idea from a policy perspective. And it starts from a view, as I said, that state members' proposal focus on two very narrow aspects of the existing separations rules. Those are part of a fabric, again, of an overall regulatory framework, and then countless separations rules that were established based on a number of choices and compromises. Other folks, you've started to hear some of that from other members of the panel. Other people the state members perceive that there's a mismatch of costs with respect to local loops. Other voices feel there is not a mismatch, or even that maybe there's an underallocation to the local loop. And the debate just kind of makes the point that as we start to get into a discussion that suggests that we can focus on just a couple of rules, fix those, and everything will be fine, is inherently flawed. There just isn't a correct system without starting at the top and addressing the main aspects of the overall framework, starting with intercarrier compensation and USF reform.
I would like, not surprisingly, to answer the second question by saying the way to implement reform is to implement the state member's proposal. Simply because something is difficult doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Second, it was characterized as narrow changes within the big picture of separations. I think these are three very big ticket items. The vastly disproportionate, the mismatch between special access revenues and where they're allocated, special access costs, where they're allocated. The second, the local loop. This is a vastly different network than we had 10 to 15 years ago. It may be maybe there's only three elements, but broad rather than narrow. These are significant issues. And the third, the bundled service revenues, where are they falling? And then lastly, the broadband keeps creeping into this. And of course, broadband deployment is extremely important, and the National Broadband Plan goals should be achieved. They're terrific, and they're heading us in the right direction. But as I understand the state member's proposal, there should not be a disincentive. That is, the calculation, as I understand it, is based on demand. So if a company spends money to serve an unserved area with a hope that customers will come, there's no allocation if there's no customers. So they go out on a limb. It's an unserved area. They deploy it. Maybe nobody wants it, but there's no reallocation. But what if they're really good at marketing? Customers really are chomping at the bit for it, and we've all heard those anecdotes. And they have a lot of demand. Well, then they have revenues, and then there's an allocation. So the state member's proposal is entirely consistent with the excellent goals of the National Broadband Plan and help us achieve those goals and put the costs in the right place. It's easy to get bogged down in, oh, it's just too much difficult. Let's do these other difficult things first. If we wait for intercarrier compensation reform and we wait for USF reform, we're going to be freezing this until 2020, until well, he's left. I thought it was, oh, he's here, until he's a grown-up. So I would be skeptical of attempts to say, oh, it's just too complicated. There's a lot of bright people who can figure it out if they needed to.
Thank you, Ms. Baldwin. I want to recognize if they have any comments with the last two questions. California, did you have any, did you want to weigh in on those two? I don't want to be unfair to you on the telephone.
Yeah, please. I think I have a couple of comments. I think in answer to the first question is you necessarily have to deny that there are changes in the market and how facilities are now used and the services that are using those facilities. You're essentially saying those services have not changed, that how the loop is being used has not changed if you're saying reform is not needed. Because if those things have changed, there is indeed a need for separations reform to reflect those changes. I think that looking then to question number two is there's been much discussion about this is as Ms. Duca was just referring, this is a big thing that has to be addressed. Other parties but there are increments that we can do or can take on to move towards a comprehensive reform. And I think that looking at this from more of a perspective as it being a phased in, yet a comprehensive reform is the best way to address this. That alleviates many of the parties' concerns that we can't do all of this at once. It's too big a thing. But at the same time, we also cannot, with changes in the market and changes with how facilities are used, keep going down a path that doesn't include reform, at least beginning at some point in the near future.
Thank you, and I will do a better job at recognizing. Please, if you have something, and if I fall short, California, please acknowledge. Thank you so much for that, Daniel Ojo.
What are the costs and benefits of pursuing separations reform, either before or after, or on a parallel track with the reform of universal service, intercarrier compensation, or special access reform? In particular, is there any more accurate cost data that's necessary to see the impact that this reform would have on the subscriber line charge, or on special access, or on universal service reform?
Mr. Smith, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry, no.
Go ahead, and I'll let her start.
Thank you, Ms. Baldwin.
I would appreciate it if we could go into all of these different, very ambitious reforms without assuming that the customer's going to foot the bill. It's so easy we'll just increase the subscriber line charge and that'll solve everything. Just sock it to the customer, and it's a federally required charge on the bill, and so shucks, the carriers say it's not our problem. So that's my first concern. But to answer the question, the first question, as I indicated before, absolutely move forward. Don't wait for intercarrier compensation. I think the gentleman from California explained it very well. Phase it in, but don't wait.
Mr. Smith?
I was fairly confident that Ms. Baldwin was going to mention something about subscriber line charges, so that's why I wanted her to go first. The plain fact of the matter is, from a carrier perspective, we do need to know what the interstate totals are going to be and the intrastate totals are going to be. At the same time, we're trying to reach some of the solution sets to the policy questions we have, for instance, in the National Broadband Plan. So we're very interested from the perspective of our clients to understand what our interstate costs are going to be and what our state costs are going to be. Those may change as a result of the interim reform. As I mentioned in my opening statement, we have some vastly different operating circumstances, and we represent some carriers that serve some very high cost to serve areas. Their interests in this are different than, for instance, some of the areas represented by Quest and Fairpoint. And there are some issues that we need to find some resolution on prior to launching into some of this interim reform. We've had some issues that have been posed to the Commission for a number of years, and Ken can touch on some of those here briefly.
Yeah, basically, we would like reform in part to be focused on issues that have been brought up in the past that the FCC has not addressed yet. GVNW has on record in the 5 to 10 year time frame questions that we've asked where we've interpreted the rule a certain way. We prepare our cost studies in consistent with those rules, and then when we submit it to NACA, NACA takes that cost study and they interpret the rule a different way, and so they adjust and remove settlements from the company because they interpret the rule different. We come to the FCC asking for clarification for those rules, and we don't get anything. So what happens every year, we prepare it according to the rules, the way we see them. NECA adjusts the settlement, and we spend a lot of time arguing about how the rule should be interpreted. And there's cost recovery that's still at stake for several years because we haven't had an answer. So we would like to see part of the reform process addressing some of those issues. I was recently informed that NECA has gone to the FCC on issues back as far as 24 years and still has not received a response. So we would like to see some of that cleaned up so that it's administratively easier for both NECA and us, and then we can move forward with ongoing reform.
Yes, Mr. Nishi.
I'll come back to that. We have a tremendous goal with the National Broadband Plan, and what we need to accomplish there could take everyone's time in this room for the next 2 or 3 years to just get through that whole process. So I think any separations form really needs to go hand in hand. Bringing it back to the rates a little bit, I look at our company and many other companies out there. Their local rates have not changed, or my local rates have not changed for years. So if we take a look at the customer's total bill, and if we do decide to allocate more of the loop to the interstate jurisdiction based on whether it's used for voice and data or voice, video, and data, more will end up into interstate jurisdiction. And if it does go to the broadband, then that means my wholesale rates will increase. And if my wholesale rates increase, I will have to raise my DSL rates. So when I add my total bill together that the customer sees, DSL, local, and any long distance, their rates will increase. Now, once again, that comes back to the whole adoption. We want to keep our rates reasonable and keep as many people on our network as possible. And at the same time, if I am not able to keep my margins the same, that comes back to the investment. There's a less of a margin for us to invest in our networks. So I look at this as really ensuring that we can continue to serve our customers and continue to build networks. And any changes without looking at the federal universal service funding mechanisms and ways to keep rates reasonable or bring money back to the networks is going to be very difficult.
Daniel? I'm sorry, Mr. Boucher.
If I could just briefly on this third question as to cost and benefits, I see a huge benefit to waiting until intercarrier comp and USF reform is done. And that is because until that is done, you really don't know what use or need you're going to have for separations after reform is completed. In terms of cost, I guess kind of conversely, I see a huge cost. You have that same problem, again, not knowing what to do until reform is done. But the cost and burden on carriers just kind of boggles the mind as I think about the suggestion, I think it was GVNW, to reform separations before, during, and after intercarrier comp and USF. Boggles the mind the amount of energy and attention it would take of the Commission and other interested parties to accomplish that, while there are surely more important things I would suggest on the agenda. And with regard to the question asked, is there a need for more accurate cost data? Again, kind of in consistent with my prior remarks, I respectfully kind of disagree with the premise of that question, that there is this notion of this holy grail of correct or accurate cost data that we need to focus like a laser on to accomplish. Again, until we know what USF and intercarrier comp reform looks like, we don't know what kind of cost data is going to be necessary for that new framework, if any. And finally, I think there was a mention of special access, in addition to sort of all the generic problems I've talked about with accomplishing sort of a laser-focused, or trying to do a laser-focused fix of some particular aspect of the separations rules, given that most of those services are not subject to cost-based regulation. I would suggest that that also does not need to be a priority of the Commission at this time.
Well, this is John Burke. Could I just ask a question of the last speaker, just with regard to special access? If, in fact, we're actually going to look at part and parcel of setting this aside until there's comprehensive reform, extremely detailed data of special access revenues and costs are pretty important to be able to come up with some sort of a comprehensive overall reform anyway, isn't it?
Well, with respect to special access, Quest and other carriers have put their position very clearly on the record on that matter. I mean, as distinct from USF and intercarrier comp, our position is that comprehensive reform is not needed for special access. And with respect, I guess, to the narrow question about cost data, we have put a pretty detailed proposal out there suggesting that the need is really for a broad view of competitive data beyond just the regulated ILECs, given the competitive nature of those services.
I guess I didn't understand that.
I think your question was, don't we need detailed historical cost data for the purposes of looking at special access? And Quest's response would be to respectfully suggest no, that if anything, what is needed in terms of cost data for the purpose of looking at special access is broad competitive data about special access throughout the competitive market.
I'd like to pick up on the, if the gentleman from California, I'd like to continue on the cost data discussion. On one hand, we're told we don't need cost information, and yet in the same conversations we're told if we fix separations, there's this veiled threat of the Commission won't be able to achieve its national broadband goals because we'll need to raise rates. First and foremost, I would urge the Commission to reimpose ARMIS reporting requirements. Are they everything we want? Are they perfect? Of course not. But it's a disadvantage to me working with consumer advocates when I go to the FCC website and I can't get data past 2007 because the ARMIS reporting requirements don't apply anymore. I think that this is the time for the Commission to revisit that forbearance decision. As an aside, service quality expires this month. That data, I rely on that extensively. It's very convenient to keep consumer advocates and regulators in the dark about data. Don't worry about costs. It's too complicated. We need to raise our rates. And it's all in together, and there's a disconnect there. Especially whether it's here for separation, certainly for intercarrier compensation reform, certainly for USF. We are going to be hearing, shucks, we want to be made whole. You take money from us here, we need to raise rates there. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe you're earning too much on special access. Maybe the DSL revenues are all going to the shareholders and none to the regulated services. Maybe there's a disconnect. Let's look at the facts. This is a fact-based commission. I'm so pleased to see all the decisions coming out referring to fact-based analytic decisions. So we need some facts, and I'm going on a little bit far here, but I really feel strongly, as you can see, I'm an about having ARMIS reinstated. And I think I just want to give Chris White may want to echo that comment, because I know that's ARMIS data is near and dear to his heart too. Chris, did you want to add anything?
Yes, we do need the data, and I think you also have to keep in mind whatever form separation reform takes, that kicks in the dual jurisdiction under the 1934 Act, which means that states get to deal with interstate rates and federal gets to deal with interstate rates, and separation reform would be an exogenous event, and under the rate cap regulations, that would trigger a reanalysis whether the rate cap rates that are in effect are either too high or too low, and you can't forget that important factor that separation reform will have an impact on the rate cap rates, and they could go up, they could go down, or they could remain the same.
Daniel?
What do you think comprehensive reform should be? We're especially interested in any comments you may have on modifications of the 25%, 75% allocation of common lines.
This is Eric in California. Before we move to question 4, could we respond to question 3?
Of course, I apologize again. Thank you.
No problem. I'm going to address question 3 more from the universal service funding perspective. And I have I have one follow-up question for some of the panelists, but before I get to that, from my perspective, I see cost benefits primarily arriving from those entities that should be receiving that funding, meaning that the universal service funding that's provided to the Fed or to the state is appropriately allocated, meaning that the companies are only paying the portion that they should be paying to the appropriate jurisdiction. I see cost savings to the companies coming from knowing how much they are to be paying and assuring that there is no double recovery by the state or the Fed. And I think we have heard this from some of our small electeds, that there's always a concern that they're going to be responsible for for providing recovery to both, and that can be very problematic. The last is to address the cost data need. From my perspective, it's much less a concern of accurate cost data as it is us needing to respond to change in use of facilities. So we could probably do with somewhat inaccurate cost data if we choose then to respond and to adjust separations more in a response to the use of those facilities rather than just how much it costs to use those facilities.
I appreciate that. Eric, right?
Yeah.
Is it Eric? Okay, thank you. And to question 4. You're on, Susan.
I feel like I was just being, let's see. Yes, as I think was clear from my initial 3-minute presentation, and if you flip through my PowerPoints toward the end, you'll see that I go one step further. Not only do I support changing the 75-25, but I actually take a crack at, based on 2007 data, taking, I did it for a few states, but the numbers that I include in the back pages of the overhead, I go through a little gory detail for New Jersey, and I say, okay, let's take a very loose approximation of the state member's proposal. Let's do a line count. I don't deal with the unis. It's a little bit simplified. And what I end up finding out is that I focus on the local loop. I won't go into all the gory detail here. It is in the handout. But the result is that more like 65% of the local loop should be on the state side of the ledger. And I do understand that it's not necessarily going through the jurisdictional separations to the interstate side. It may well be going to unregulated and be a Part 64 matter, but I would simply, again, urge this joint board and the commission to fix Part 64. If you look at what's set to unregulated, I'll just give you two numbers. For New York, 2007, again, that's the best I can do because that's the best that's there. Total plant and service for New York is $13.7 billion. Of this $13.7 billion for the plant and service, only $602 million is allocated to non-regulated services. $602 million. Now, they're getting it nationally, not including the fourth buck, Fairpoint. We're talking about $13 billion NTSL revenues. And so there's clearly a mismatch.
Mr. Smith.
With response to that question, want to touch back a little bit on a follow-up on question 3. It leads into 4. Mr. Boucher mentioned that it boggled his mind that we would want to do reform before, during, and after. I'll reference Susan's comment from earlier. Just because something is difficult does not mean that we don't do it. And there are a lot of things on the agenda right now. The Commission has done a good job getting around the country explaining some of their ideas on the blueprint of the National Broadband Plan, and that's certainly, we had the privilege of having Carol Maddie come out to Oregon and Washington and talk to the companies there. It's helpful to hear that this is a blueprint and the start of a process, but with respect to comprehensive reform, in slide 9 of the handouts you have from Ken and I, we believe the best way to accomplish that one path would be to handle interim considerations of changes considered in the proceedings for intercarrier compensation, USF, and MBP. Some of the policies that will need to be addressed in these proceedings would include that the resulting cost assignment must be clear so that rural carriers' constitutional rights for cost recovery are not blurred, and any transition from an existing scheme should provide a clear delineation of roles and responsibilities. And with respect to rate of return, rural carriers should not be transitioned from rate of return regulation unless and until an administratively feasible plan is developed that ensures the carrier's constitutional rights are met.
Ms. Yask?
Just to add to those points, well, a couple of observations. One, earlier Ken talked about various issues that have been come up for disputes, and NECA would welcome clarification of them. I'm not aware of any 24-year-old issues that are still, on the table, but there may very well be. We're required by the Commission to address, interpretations of the rules as they come up, and we do the best we can with that. But of course, we would support Commission clarification of those issues as they're outstanding, and that, of course, is not separations reform, but it's something that's important to do. And the same thing with other kind of interim issues that come up that need to be addressed. We would welcome those things. Secondly, but more generally, the talk. I think several people have made the point here that the world is changing, and it certainly has changed since the separations freeze was imposed, and changed wildly more since the separations rules were developed. But we anticipate that. I mean, we're looking at a marketplace for broadband services, for where the voice services that kind of defined how separations rules were developed are, as they say, just becoming an app on the broadband network. We're looking at a world where carriers may no longer offer these kinds of joint and common services anymore the way that they did when the separations rules are defined. And, it just seems to make sense to us that as the Commission is working to develop a view of how that market is going to be structured, how regulation is going to be structured. In the past, they've done those things first. An obvious example is when the access charge rules were implemented. That stuff was done, and the implications for how separations worked were kind of worked through afterwards. I'm not saying it always has to be done that way, but it just seems to make sense that since we're all focused on redefining the marketplace in terms of broadband, that has dramatic effects on things like separations rules, that if we have a sense of where that's going, then we can sit down and talk about how to comprehensively reform separations rules. And to me, that's the order of things, not the other way around. So.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman?
Yes, thank I want to go back to the basis of separations. When you boil it down, separations has to do with setting rates. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, it was established in a time when telephone companies were monopoly providers. And the basic deal was we got to serve the market, but our ability to charge monopolistic rates was constrained by rate of return regulation. So obviously there's a lot of vestiges of rate of return regulation hanging on. So with respect to Fairpoint, which is a mid-sized carrier but also a BOC, I would characterize our operating territory as being more like a BOC than most of the other mid-sized carriers, which generally serve more rural areas. And so when you look at the announcements by Quest, by AT&T, by Verizon, year over year they're losing 10% in access lines. And what that tells me is that we're subject to competition. So if the purpose of separations is essentially to establish rates, if we are not subject to rate of return regulation, either through operation of price cap regulation, through operation of being deregulated, or because of market forces, then separations isn't needed. So I propose that for companies who are in that situation, and I know people in this room will disagree as to whether a company like Fairpoint is purely subject to market forces, I say that I think for the most part we are. If that's the case, then separations reform would simply allow separations to go away for carriers who are under those circumstances.
Thank you. Eric Daniel Ojo. Didn't want to not recognize you again, Eric.
Thank you. I didn't hear the second speaker identify himself, but I definitely would like to support those comments. But just to follow up on that, I have one quick question that kind of speaks to this. Is we've heard from, I believe it was NECA and Quest, who have inferred that changes in separations will result in increases in costs. And considering this shift, say, from 25 to 75% or whatever, if there's a shift to 30 to 70, how does that in itself incur cost to those companies? I'd really like to hear that to get a better understanding of what the result to those companies, or at least what they're assuming the result would be from this question. Anybody?
This is Tim Boucher for Quest. I'm not sure what comment you're referring to, honestly.
And this is Rick Askoff again from NECA. I don't think that we said that separations reform would increase costs in itself. It's really talking about cost shifting, from one place to another. You can have a situation where costs that are widely spread amongst one group of services, ratepayers, what have you, tend to get focused in one place, which I think is a very shorthand way of describing the kind of analysis that we did for DSL rates. And that could cause dramatic rate increases in one service and very small, or non-existent cost reductions, or I should say rate reductions in others. But that's just an effect of taking widespread costs and focusing them on one service. It's not a matter of cost increase.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. That's my understanding also, that it's just a shift, and I wanted to make sure there wasn't some increase in cost that you were finding that we were not aware of. Thank you.
Thank you. And Eric, that was Fairpoint that was speaking, that prompted you to ask that question. Just wanted to help you out on that, just in case you don't go to our fcc.gov and see us later.
All right, thank you.
Daniel Ojo?
What do you think of the proposal for the FCC to allow states to set their own separations rules for state rate making purposes, either on a one-time or an ongoing basis? And if they do so, should there be any limitations or constraints upon that process?
Mr. Smith?
Joel, this is Jeff from GV&W. Joel, one thing that would need to be a caveat in place before that were to occur would be only if the FCC were to allow the recovery of costs the states decide to assign back to the interstate jurisdiction. And that might seemingly run contrary to the whole joint board concept we've had in place for all these years, and even though this is the first time this group is back together, the idea is you have the two parties working together to jointly agree on who's going to get what allocation. It's possible you would have a state put forth a plan that would shift costs back to interstate, and then it would be necessary for the FCC to allow recovery of that, at least for the rate of return carriers.
Mr. Boucher?
Yes, and I would just say briefly, the FCC has preempted the field of separations. So any attempt to allow individual states the right to determine cost allocation would conflict with past FCC decisions and judicial decisions. But in addition to that legal issue, it just strikes me as not a helpful policy idea. I'm just, among other things, I mean, it leaves the possibility of having 50 different determinations of cost allocation of a given piece of investment, which just doesn't make sense, I don't think.
This is Chris White. I have a different view on whether or not they're preempted, states are preempted. I think you're ignoring the Louisiana Public Service Commission case in 1996 dealing with depreciation rates, where the U.S. Supreme Court, relying on Section 152 of the Act, specifically asserted that there's dual jurisdiction and that the states could have its own depreciation rates. I think they can have their own allocation of costs for purposes of setting intrastate rates.
And for those who may be watching online, Chris is from the New Jersey Division of Rate Counsel.
And echoing that, I think it's important for any state who does take the time to look at costs, and I'll admit that not a lot of states are these days, but if a state does need to look at costs, absolutely from a policy perspective, I believe that they should be encouraged to examine and make their own determinations on separations, whether it has to do with reallocation to unregulated or separations from state to interstate.
Danielle Joel?
How should the jurisdictional nature of revenues affect cost assignments? For example, are there cases where it is appropriate to assign costs and expenses to one jurisdiction while assigning revenues related to those costs and expenses to the other jurisdiction? Or to no jurisdiction, for example, DSL loops, non-regulated services under Part 64, information services, broadband, video transport, etc.
I think the comments that I've been making up to this point have been addressing that question implicitly and explicitly. I think there is a serious mismatch that does need to be corrected between the $13 billion of DSL revenues that go to the carriers that they don't show up any on either the interstate or intrastate regulated side at all. It's all gravy for the carriers, and yet the cost to the local loop is largely borne by the state, 75%. Similarly, on special access, I think we've got a serious mismatch of cost and revenues. So I think that it's entirely unfair and should be corrected on an interim basis by June of this year, and then on a more comprehensive basis as the joint board deems appropriate.
Fairpoint?
Yes, this is Mike Scriven with Fairpoint. There's a number of aspects to this question. My first thought in reading the first part of the question with respect to costs in one jurisdiction and revenues in another is the manner in which the high-cost loop fund works, where essentially the separations assigns additional cost to the interstate jurisdiction for high-cost loop funding, and that is essentially an expense adjustment to the state side. So that's not really a mismatch, but it's sort of a shift of jurisdictions. I also want to point out and clarify that essentially the accounting for what we are calling here DSL revenues. In the 2005 broadband order, the FCC established for price cap carriers that what I call broadband interstate access services can and should be deregulated, at least for price cap carriers. And the service that we're talking about is not end-user DSL. What we're talking about is a function that the ILEC provides to ISPs, and including the ILEC's affiliate ISP, that gives them access from a centralized point in the ILEC's network out to the end user. So it's access to the end user. It's not retail DSL services. And the ILEC is, through the affiliate transactions, the ILEC is compensated for this per rule at the higher of cost or market from its affiliate when it's providing that service to an affiliate. The revenue for that is in a regulated account pursuant to the FCC order, which, if I can take a liberty to sort of generalize how I read it, the FCC order said, look, these companies are price cap regulated. Their actual costs don't matter for interstate rate making. We've determined that broadband internet access service is an interstate service. And so rather than putting into place elaborate costing requirements to take the broadband internet access service out of regulated operations and move it into deregulated, that we will leave it in essentially the revenues in special access, and so are the costs. And the affiliate transaction rules take care of any issues with respect to how that cost is transferred to an affiliate when in fact it's sold to an affiliate. So I want to address that. And the other thing I wanted to address within the state member's proposal was the concept of allocating costs associated with unis through a separations process. And essentially my concern there is that the revenue that we get for unis is based on TELRIC pricing, which is admittedly a very aggressive pricing, which allows the ILECs very limited recovery for uni rates. To only allow us to recover the revenue on that basis, but then to require us to allocate cost to that based on separations principles, to me seems like it would provide a mismatch and put us in a situation where we were not able to recover our costs associated with services, and the costs were being removed from the separations process.
Thank you. Chris or Eric, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do. This is Eric. And I wanted to speak to the previous question just very quickly. I think that the intent of the joint board is to develop a universal scheme that I think all states could adhere to. And with that understanding, I see that there needs to be a necessary harmony between the separations structures being utilized by the FCC and any specific state. That maybe there is some way to pursue that harmony amongst the FCC and individual states, but I see that as something very hard to do. And unless there can be a harmony between the state and FCC separations factors, meaning there's no double counting, there is no overlap or additional problems, that I don't see how differing factors could actually be pursued. Speaking to question number 6, I'd say definitely 6 is no, and this is one of the fundamental reasons reform is needed, is that we are now starting to see shifts in costs and not revenues. California now has some experience with rate of return carriers that are requesting costs to be allocated on the intrastate side, but they do not want to provide the state with any of the resulting revenues. So we are already seeing requests from rate of return carriers for the state to incur those interstate costs without being able to see those revenues. separate. Thank
Mr.
you.
Burchett,
Yeah, the way I view it is that the separations joint board and the separations rules, ultimate goal is to assign jurisdiction or responsibility for cost. Once those costs are assigned to either state or interstate, that's the jurisdictional separations, and those costs assigned to the state has the jurisdiction over how those will be recovered. The costs assigned to interstate, the FCC has the authority over how those costs will be assigned. The level of linkage between specific costs and rates is a policy decision that's up to the independent jurisdictions. With regards to the FCC, for price cap companies, that's fairly loose, and they have a lot of flexibility. There may be a cost that's more linked to one service, but that service may be too high, so they allow that to be shifted over to a different service. That's exactly what the fact is with regards to DSL that travels on a joint loop. If it's traveling on a joint loop, for the large companies, 25% of that gets assigned over to interstate, but it doesn't end up in DSL, it ends up in common line. The FCC has the jurisdiction to assign that to common line, and that's where it's recovered. Our fear is that if it changes and more cost associated with DSL comes over, the current policy may change and that cost may get assigned to DSL. And I think that's what NECA's concern is too, because for the small companies, when the FCC made the decision in the wideband order to exactly do that, one of the reasons was that for small companies, if you shifted that cost for DSL and put it in special access, the DSL rates would go so high, the small companies wouldn't be able to sell the service. So those policy decisions are left to each jurisdiction. The level of linkage is the policy issue that each party needs to decide. And we think for the smaller companies that are on rate of return, there's a fairly close linkage for most of the individual costs. But that's a policy decision. If the FCC wanted to relax that and allow more shifting between services, that's within their authority. On the state side, the states have the authority. A good example on the state side is value of service pricing. The cost of a business loop is generally much less than a rural subscriber loop, but most states allow the companies to charge more for business service than they do for residential service. That's a value of service pricing. That's not associated directly with the cost of providing that service. It's other policies that are coming into play.
Susan?
I have two things to say. One is a question, and then the second is a suggestion. There's been reference to if more costs were shifted to the DSL bucket, DSL prices would have to go up. So my question, perhaps for later this morning, to the panelists from carriers is, do they set their DSL prices based on all of these different cost allocations? That is, if the cost went over, are you guided by this separations process in how you set DSL prices, or do you view it as competitive and you set the price relative to how cable does it? Second, I mean, does it make any difference in how you price, really? Second, there's also was reference to the wideband order and affiliates and compensation and the revenue showing up in the special access bucket. My recommendation, if I were a member of the joint board and if I was allowed to do discovery, I would ask the carriers specifically for data about their retail revenues and where they show up specifically by row number, and so that you know. I throw out $13 billion, which I compute based on websites, based on demand data, based on public information. I've seen lots of confidential data. I obviously don't use that. You have the authority, I believe, or somebody at the FCC to ask questions. I would get some data on demand and revenues and exactly where it shows up in that transfer that was discussed, because when I work in regulatory proceedings, I just like to see those numbers and have it be crystal clear, that specific transaction, and that was helpful to hear, but I'd want to see the numbers from the carrier. So I would urge the joint board to do a little bit of, I don't want to prolong the process because I think this can be implemented by June, but some quick questions just to get some key facts out.
We've got about 6.5 minutes before the break, and Mr. Boucher, you wanted to tackle that?
I just wanted to say quickly, with response to question 6, that the FCC has rejected the use of revenue-based allocators and properly found in the past that they are not an efficient method of cost allocation.
Anybody else?
We understand that current commission rules require carriers to update direct assignments annually, but notwithstanding some of the things that Roger said, we understand that some carriers are not updating those direct assignments annually. Do you believe that enforcing that direct assignment requirement be updated, that it be updated annually, will alleviate some of the imbalance between investments and cost allocation for special access?
Mrs. Smith?
As Roger mentioned earlier, many rate of return carriers have not frozen their categorization in an attempt to be fully compliant with the direct assignment provisions of those rules. So for that segment of the interest of the industry, there's really no imbalance to correct, Joel.
Okay. Mr. Scriven?
Yes, this is Mike Scriven.
Scriven, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
South Carolina thing, I'm sorry.
For the people on the bridge, I wanted to know who is speaking. And, of course, Fairpoint Communications it recently became subject, or, became subject to ARMIS requirements. We haven't actually filed any of the ARMIS cost data yet because of the way the rules work. Our first filing is required in 2011 for 2010 data. My personal background doesn't include extensive, or really any ARMIS reporting. I came out of mid-sized carriers, and I have a very long history of separations, but I was not involved with a company who is required to do ARMIS reports. However, I took the liberty of going out to the FCC ARMIS website to look at the 2007 ARMIS 4304 report for Maine for 2007, which is the latest year that's out there. And I was also, I want to say, since we haven't filed one yet, we haven't dealt with one of the questions on the table, which is whether or not there's a requirement to update the private line direct assignments. I don't know if there is or not. I'm not going to admit there is, but let's just assume that the question is on the table, should those be updated, and if so, what impact would that have? In looking at, and this is all publicly available information, anybody who wants to go to the ARMIS website and look at the 2007 Maine study area can do so. For the plant subject to separations, and essentially I looked at the investment rate base for purposes of this analysis. There's approximately 70% allocated to the state jurisdiction and 30% allocated to the interstate jurisdiction. And again, I have to qualify this, I'm not an ARMIS expert, but in looking at it, there was a number of lines in the ARMIS report which indicated direct assigned private line. Now, one of the things I noticed about the direct assigned private line is none of them were directly assigned to one or the other jurisdictions. They were allocated. So I went through and I subtotaled, just purely based on that ARMIS information, how much of the telephone plant was in line items on the ARMIS report that says direct assigned to private line. And 16% of it was. So that'll give you an idea of how much in that particular study area, which is relevant to us, how much of it was subject to, at least arguably, some sort of direct assignment. Then I subtotaled the state and interstate columns associated with that and found out for those categories, about, in round numbers, 60% of those costs in those categories were allocated to the interstate jurisdiction and 40 were allocated to the state jurisdiction. So the question for Maine becomes, if I understand Armis correctly, of that 16% of the plant, which is arguably or not directly assignable, it's already 60-40 interstate-state. And so the question would be, if you were to go through that, what would you find in terms of whether or not an update of those direct assignment would change that, would move more to the interstate jurisdiction or more to the intrastate jurisdiction? And then just as a technical matter, I want to point out that under the separations freeze, the amount of dollars going into those categories is not, it doesn't change from year to year. The category freeze dictates how much goes into those categories, and the question on the table would be, should we update or in some way change the direct assignment of that? And it's hard for me to believe, based on those numbers, that updating those or in some manner dealing with those would have any significant impact on the jurisdictional nature of what comes out of Armis.
Mr. Boucher?
I would just quickly, respectfully disagree with the premise of the question. Quest, as a price cap carrier, carriers, we believe, Quest, of course, is under forbearance now, but was not required to update direct assignments annually under the Commission's freeze rules.
Thank you. And before we take a break, I'd like to tee up a question that came from Ann Weymouth of the Wisconsin PSC, who asked, could Fairpoint and others further discuss the matching of revenues to expenses? For example, doesn't the broadband order allow varying treatment of DSL costs and revenues so that Fairpoint could assign DSL costs as regulated and assign DSL revenues as unregulated? How should this treatment of DSL costs and revenues impact separations reform? So while you get your donuts, you can think on that, and I'll re-ask the question just in case you've forgotten it. Thank you, and we'll take a 15-minute break at this time. To recognize, before we re-tee up the question, Susan, I believe, I did not, Steve told me that you had a question, so I apologize for.
I think I didn't respond to question 7, so I thought I would put in my 2 cents.
All right.
There was a reference in the context of responses to question 7 that revenues are not an appropriate allocator, and I agree that they're not the best allocator. They're not the ideal allocator, but I think as an interim measure, they're far better than the status quo. 2 other quick points. If you turn to the page that's up on the screen, and that's the 4th page from the back of my handout, this takes us through 2007. Again, we are hampered, all of us, because we don't have Armis data for more recent years. But even looking from 2001, from the freeze, to 2007, 3 years ago, we see that when you look at interstate services as a percentage of total revenues, they have been increasing. And as I'm looking at this, I'm now frankly drawing a blank on whether in my revenues I've included, whether this is just special access or whether this is all revenues. I would need to look back at that. But the point is that there is a mismatch, and so to answer the question, yes, there should be a direct assignment should shift from year to year to recognize the increasing growth on the interstate side for special access services.
Thank you. And anyone on the telephone would like to respond before I move to the Wisconsin question?
This is Eric. I don't have any comments on question 7. Thank you.
Chris, are you still there?
Yes, I am, and I don't have any either.
And Mr. Boucher?
I have one thing that I'd like some clarification on. Several times it's been mentioned here that the direct assignment piece has been frozen and that we should have the option of unfreezing it. I know there was some comments in the initial freeze order saying all categories and subcategories would be frozen, but that direct assignment would remain in place. When I read the rules for the cable and wire facilities, the rules seem to me to be very specific that the freeze is at the category 1 level. and the subcategorization to the 1.1, which is direct assigned to state, 1.2 to interstate or vice versa, and the amount that goes to joint is not within that paragraph that freezes the allocation. Has there been some other order or something that has frozen it at the subcategory level as well?
I think we'll have to, Daniel, do you have an answer to that?
A number of parties have filed comments indicating that their reliance on staff direction has indicated that they are not required to update direct assignments annually. But no, there has not been an order on that.
Mr. Boucher?
Yeah, Rule 36.3B specifies that for LEC subject to price cap regulation, a requirement that all investment categories and subcategories and relationships be frozen. And as we've filed on a number of times, it's impossible to both to annually update direct cost assignments and to follow that instruction. So, and as Mr. Ball indicates, that has been confirmed by in FCC staff communication.
Thank you. I will go back to the Wisconsin question. Could Fairpoint and others further discuss the matching of revenues to expenses? For example, doesn't the broadband order allow varying treatment of DSL cost and revenues so that Fairpoint could assign DSL cost as regulated and assign DSL revenues as unregulated? How should this treatment of DSL costs and revenues impact separations reform?
Yes, this is Mike Scriven with Fairpoint. I'm sorry, but I'm just not aware where in that order that there's that indication. I can just say from my standpoint, I understand that we are matching what I call the broadband internet access service revenues and costs in the same location in special access, in interstate special access.
And any others want to address that? Okay, Joel?
Should the Commission allow carriers a one-time opportunity to freeze or unfreeze category relationships? What would the likely impact of such an opportunity be?
This question kind of stumps me. I'm not quite sure what it's getting at here. I'm a little bit concerned if it's, I guess I need to understand what that one-term opportunity would be, and would interested parties have the option to seek a different one-time would it be totally carrier-driven as to when they freeze and don't freeze, which might create odd economic incentives? So I think there's something behind this question I'm simply not getting.
Yes, Mr. Aska.
Just to respond to that as best I can, I think I mentioned earlier before that there were about 40 or so rate of return companies that had elected to freeze their categorizations. You know, as I guess it's consistent with the observations made elsewhere that, you know, it's been a long time that freeze has been in effect, and what they have said is that when they initially made that election, they were expecting something like a 5-year freeze, and it's now turned out to be about a 10-year freeze, and so they've asked for an opportunity to relook at that. There are a lot of ins and outs about exactly how you would do that. You know, would it be an option to unfreeze and then update from that point on? Would it be an option to unfreeze and then refreeze? And, you know, exactly how you do that is kind of complicated. But, you know, we've filed comments on this in the past. There have been companies that have come in with specific requests, but I believe that it is an option, at the carrier's option, that we've asked for. It's only a small number of companies that are affected or are likely to want to do it, and I don't expect that it would be much of an impact one way or the other. And we've only asked for it in terms of for those companies that were given the option, namely the rate of return carriers, to do that, not everyone. So does that help, Susan?
Yes. And this is Mike Scriven from Fairpoint, and I think I referenced this a little bit earlier with respect to Fairpoint operating about 28 or so rate of return study areas. Some of them have converted to price caps, and we're looking at similar treatment for the others. And should we do that and need to continue with the detailed underlying cost studies, that would be expensive, and it would be an expense we would like to avoid if we could, and it would be reasonable under those circumstances. And I'm not ruling out other circumstances. I'm just saying in our specific circumstance, an option to freeze categories would be welcome, and it would probably, particularly if we convert to price caps, it would not have a significant impact on rate making, and it would allow us to streamline our underlying costs.
Yeah, I wanted to tease something in. If I am unfairly categorizing this as it relates to the matching of revenues and expenses, Michael, if you let me know if I am, and Timothy, I believe Fairpoint may assign DSL revenue to regulated an environment, but Quest does not assign DSL revenue to their in this regulated environment. Am I correct? Quest assigns this to in a non-regulated text. So the broadband order subject to check does allow for varying treatment. Am I correct? I might be very badly stating that, but
yes, the broadband order did instruct that costs for for broadband internet access were to continue to be treated as regulated.
Okay. But does it allow for varying? It allows for varying treatment. Okay. Then we'll get that answered later. Thanks. Joel or Daniel?
Yes. Notwithstanding all the hype and rhetoric that's been swirling around regarding broadband deployment, how can we evaluate whether or not any proposals for separations changes, either interim or permanent, will have an effect or influence efficient broadband deployment by carriers subject to separations?
Susan?
I'll go ahead.
Of course.
I think it will be extremely important in the short term and in the long term as the Commission implements the National Broadband Plan to be very careful of that goal becoming an excuse to not do important reform in different matters, including separations. As I mentioned earlier, the state member's proposal by basing the allocation of the local loop on actual line counts should not discourage investment. I raised a question that I would urge the Commission to continue to explore this morning, which is, on one hand, it seems as if we're being told cost studies are not quite relevant and let's move forward with the National Broadband Plan. But if we were to fix the cost studies, carriers would need to raise broadband rates. So I come back to how exactly do carriers set broadband rates? And so throughout this ongoing dialogue, and it's extremely important to implement the National Broadband Plan goals, but let's be careful and just keep coming back to the facts. Why specifically would, I'm not asking, the question should be continuously asked of the industry, explain more carefully, show me the data that demonstrates that suddenly you would not be able to do the National Broadband Plan.
Yes, Ms. Ashcroft.
And this is to address some of the questions that came up before. When we, with the associations, filed comments in response to the state member's proposal, what we did was we were able to look at a sample of companies that participate across the country in the NECA pool. And we did what Susan described earlier as kind of back-of-the-envelope estimates of how that would work, and it necessarily included a bunch of assumptions because we don't know exactly how carriers would recategorize their cable and wire facility costs under the state member's proposal. There's a lot of things that you need to know about individual lines, whether they're used for this, for voice, for voice, data, video. Those things would all kind of shake out in the process in different ways. So, in an attempt to give kind of a range of potential things, what we did is we made some assumptions about how if all of the current DSL lines are assigned to one of the new categories, this is the result that you would get in terms of reallocation to the special access category. If you assumed, on the other hand, that they would all go to this other category, then this is the result that you would get. And we recognize that the truth is probably somewhere in between. And then the question of exactly what effect that would have on DSL rates once it moves to the special access category, again, you have to make assumptions there about how that would all work. I guess the point, it's probably too complicated to go into here, and certainly for me to handle, but we did detail the parameters of that analysis in our comments that we filed in April, and those are on the record if the Commission wants to look at it. So.
And I think also important to that, the back of the envelope calculation on the costs is understanding where the revenues are going. And there's been various discussions. There was the question the Commissioner recently brought up, where a better accounting of the broadband revenues, how much are showing back up in special access or somewhere versus are they outside of the regulated pot altogether. So let's remember, we're not just looking at costs, but we're looking at revenues.
Commissioner, if I could respond to that, as far as I know, and I would need to verify this with our folks back home, but we're talking about regulated DSL costs within the NECA pools, and the companies in turn report those revenues to the pool as well. So, as far as we're concerned, there's not a mismatch between those two things. Again, I want to confirm that, but and of course, when we speak of DSL, we're talking about, I think someone earlier mentioned that it's a service that allows for end users to connect to the ISP point of presence. It's not the same thing as broadband internet access with all of the other services that go along with that. This was an issue in the Commission's third way proceeding, I think, exactly what it is that a NECA tariff DSL offering encompasses. And it really is just access to the ISP point of presence, the overall service. That's provided by an affiliate or a non-affiliate or someone else out there that buys that service, and those revenues are not part of this thing, but then neither are the costs. So.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Anyone on the telephone?
Yeah, this is Eric. I'd like to respond to question 9, and I look at this question from a somewhat differing perspective. From my perspective, I see the current structure as more the problem and maybe a barrier to deployment. I would say that if states were provided jurisdictional authority over broadband or separations included portions that went to the state, states would be more likely to encourage deployment. I'd further say that if states shared in the associated revenues, they'd be also more likely to share in the associated costs. And then just from some practical standpoint, California, although I had just said these previous two things, California has actually chosen to incur the costs associated with broadband deployment through granting, although we are not realizing those revenues. I don't see that as a preferred structure, though. And if the FCC is choosing or wishes to find ways to encourage deployment, that there has to be some benefit realized by the state from a revenue perspective if they'd like them to then incur costs that would help to push broadband deployment nationally.
Thank you. Eric? That was Eric. Chris?
Yeah, I would suggest that one of the problems you've got here is, and the Commission is wrestling with this now, is how is broadband going to be regulated? And if they move forward with treating it as a Title II service, that's going to put it back in the dual jurisdictional role that I discussed earlier. And the question then will become what roles will the states play in setting rates for the interstate portion of the telecom service. The other thing I think we should bear in mind is that the joint plant is used to provide voice, data, and video services. And to give you an example, in New Jersey, Verizon's video offering is considered telecom plant by its statewide franchise. It's not a separate video plant. So what you have to do before you even get to an idea of what are the regulated costs to separate, you've got to back out the plant that's used to provide a non-regulated service like video, which is not a telecom service. And this is part of the problem. And it also exists with AT&T because their use service rides on their telecom plant. And again, these are some of the issues that you need to look at and explore and get the bottom of, so you can end up, hopefully, with separations rules that make sense.
Mr. Boucher?
If I could just respond briefly on this issue with respect to broadband. Quest is kind of a step removed here because of forbearance and our status of not being under cost regulation in our various jurisdictions. But as I understand it, I mean, the concern is that to the extent that changes like the state member's proposal is a concern that intrastate rates may be too high because of a mismatch in costs, and so the motivation is to reduce those rates. If at the same time, on the other hand, broadband services are, and it's because of a concern of over allocation to the intrastate jurisdiction because of broadband. Well, the practical effect is, to the extent that broadband services are competitive and prices can't be raised, the practical effect is to eliminate a revenue source when you sort of focus, again, kind of going back to my initial points of just focusing on one part of sort of the fabric of the overall regulation. And so if that's the practical effect, then that, just plain and simple, less revenue, harder to make broadband investment.
Mrs. Smith?
Just one supplemental comment. We've talked a lot about costs, and we really haven't delved into the issue between investment cost and maintenance or operating costs. The focus right now is to deploy broadband, and especially in unserved areas, but it would be important not to lose sight of the fact that we will have recurring maintenance costs that are allocated through the jurisdictional separations process, and we need to be aware of those and be able to account for that in the rate structures and allow carriers to recover those operating costs, so that not only do we increase our deployment of broadband now in 2010, 2011, but we're maintaining that all the way out to 2020 and beyond.
Thank you. Daniel?
Thank you. I'd like to ask each panelist to describe what they think the final separations reform should look like, assuming an all-IP network, and specifically if you could address whether or not there'd be any role for minutes of use measurement, if there could be a limited number of categories and fixed allocation for those fixed allocators for those categories.
Do you mind if I go last on this one to give this a little more thought?
Well, Mr. Smith was strategically answered his, so we will grant you the same courtesy.
Thank you.
I should make you go first, Mr. Smith.
Would you like me to go first?
I would.
I was going to send it down to Roger, and we'll bring it this way.
If you would like, that would. Roger.
When it comes to an all-IP network, we're really going to have to look back to the states, because will there still be a requirement that we have voice to all customers in areas we serve, and can we service all those customers in an all-IP network? That's taking them off the current voice network and saying everyone's going to have a DSL line in their home, and the voice is going to ride on that. So if that's the case, and the cost of that DSL line is, say, $45, then we're going to have to take a look at our whole Lifeline and link-up programs. So as we move to an all-IP world, a lot of it's going to come back to the states and what they determine our carrier of last resort requirements to be, and whether we need to maintain the old network. Now, as we move, and maybe at some point in time, that would require just a flash cut. I'm not there yet, though, because in many instances, getting customers to give up their old black phone that's been sitting there forever, that may, in some instances, may still have a dial on it, is very difficult. Jeff, I'll turn it over to you. You can probably add to that.
That's a good segue to the point that I wanted to make, is we can talk about it theoretically in terms of an all IP network, but we're a ways away from that. That's perhaps an end point. There has to be some type of a transition mechanism to get to that point. And I echo your comment. When we talk to clients, there's been some effective communication, making customers aware that we may be moving toward that era. But there are a lot of people that are real happy with the phone service they have now. Their needs are different, and I'm not sure how you meet their needs if you don't allow them to continue to do that. Now, that being said, that's not the focus of the policy at this point, and to try to respond directly to the question, in an all IP network, minutes become somewhat irrelevant. I think you have to come up with some type of a capacity base. We're looking at some issues in terms of some of the. This requires me to get into some of the IC reform type discussion. We've done some pricing and looked at if you move certain carriers. If you look at what their rates would be without some of the universal service support, you'd have rates well in excess of $100 per customer per month. That's neither reasonable nor comparable. If you look at not maintaining some type of an access stream, so when you do that, minutes are going to go away. They're going to go away before we get to an all IP network. So you look at some type of capacity basis. Now, to respond to the question, do you get down to a limited number of factors? That's really hard to say without seeing what some alternatives would be in terms of various draft rules. You certainly could get to a point where you'd have fewer factors, and if you go back to Smith versus Illinois Bell, they have the language in there that extreme nicety is not required. But having been in this business 3 decades, I would guess that we'll end up with more than a few factors to accomplish the public policy goals and meet the needs of all the individual areas and all the individual states.
Yes, Richard.
Thank you. This is Rick Askoff again from NECA. I wanted to address one thing that came up on the call, and I don't want to leave a misapprehension about this. A lot of us have said that the commission, the joint board, the commissioners should defer consideration of these issues until after comprehensive reform. And the question was whether by that do you mean let this thing go until we really have this all completely done and everything? And the answer is no. I mean, what we really need is some sense of the policy direction and where things are going, and then you design separations reform accordingly. There is going to be a long transition before we sunset the PSTN, as people are saying, and there are a lot of people that still use voice service, and I have a feeling that these issues are going to be somewhat simpler as people move off to an IP network and as customers adopt that and as the regulations change. But the point that I wanted to make is that it's interesting to think about what things might be like 20 years from now. We need to deal with this stuff sooner than that. Our suggestion is to work out the policy on pricing for these services, the regulation. To what extent is IP services going to be regulated by states at all? If not, then this problem kind of gets a lot simpler, I think. So just that clarification. Thank you.
Mr. Scriven?
Yes, this is Mike Scriven from Fairpoint. And I'll go back to a point I made earlier. In the context of services which use IP technology, to the extent those services are offered pursuant to price cap regulation, to the extent they're deregulated, or to the extent that they're constrained by market forces, then separations is just not relevant to the whole question because separations will not be used to establish the rates for those services.
Mr. Boucher?
Thank you. I would say it's a lot to digest quickly and would want to get that complete thought. I guess my initial reaction is I come back to what I've said before, that until, even with those assumptions, until you know what intercarrier comp and USF is going to look like going forward, it's hard it's impossible to know what the content of the separations rules should look like going forward, and that's why we suggest get that done first. In the meantime, don't try to do narrow fixes in this broader fabric that try to address sort of narrowly what's perceived to be mismatches that are debatable, I think, as we've shown on this panel. Still, Quest has detailed in the past what kind of generic characteristics the separations reform, comprehensive reform may look like, with some principles along the lines of keep in mind there's no direct answer, keep it simple, complexity and detail do not increase the accuracy of the process, usage-based allocators are much less meaningful in that today and even in that coming environment, and try to work through a small number of fixed allocators. But that said, I guess I'd just conclude I agree with Mr. Scrivan that I mean, the end state should be, as we move to less and less regulation, that that separations will reach a point where it's no longer needed.
Okay. Mr. White of New Jersey?
Yes. If in fact the cost of these changes for wireline was $100 a month, then you have to, I think, ask yourself if the cable and wireless alternatives out there are substantially less costly. There are rates well below $100 a month for wireless coverage or for cable coverage, to the extent there's a cable operator in these areas. So it reaches an issue that there's something wrong if you're subsidizing a service, that if you change the rules and the service is now $100 to provide it, should the government be subsidizing an inefficient carrier when there are other alternatives available? And then the other thing I would point out, and Lifeline is a good example of this, you now have wireless Lifeline offerings from multiple carriers, which are generally far superior to the Lifeline offerings of what I will call the incumbent ILECs. So this shows you what the benefits are from innovation and competition.
Thank you. And Eric, is your last name Van Wambeke? Oh, help me out with.
Van Wambeke.
Wambeke. Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to, there's so many French influences. I was just, so I apologize for that. Eric, I can say that one. Do you have a comment?
So I have a couple of just very quick. I think that if we're looking at this from an entirely all IP network perspective, under the current separations and assignment structure, you're basically, if that happens, there will be no obligations for the state to nearly pay for anything, and at the same time there will also be no universal service revenues or any services that are subject to state universal service revenues. So you then leave the states with no way to subsidize state programs. So I think that's one thing that has to be considered on an ongoing basis. That may necessitate an all IP network being separated to allow for the state to seek at least some recovery to support its own programs. So that's one thing that must be considered. And then I had a quick question. We talked about minutes of use on an IP network, which may not be a good indicator, but are there not other usage-based indicators that could potentially be used that are not minutes of use? I don't know if that's been discussed. No one has discussed that, at least on this call, and I think that maybe there is another indicator that is not minutes of use that would help to assign costs and revenues and provide framework for separations under an IP network.
Thank you. Ms. Baldwin?
Thank you, Commissioner, for the additional time to reflect on this, probably the hardest question posed so far. I agree we're not there yet at an all IP network. I think during this transition and when we arrive at the all IP network, whether you call it ARMIS or anything else, I think it continues to be important for regulators to know what costs are being put as carriers request on the regulated side of the bucket, and whether most of the costs are going to regulated and most of the revenues are going to unregulated. If we go in that trend that we've started down now, there could be repercussions for the most vulnerable customers if broadband does not become a competitive market, and I don't believe it is now. We have at best a duopoly. I think we continue to have concerns whether you call it voice or broadband, and if broadband is the medium of the future, are the rates that consumers are charged, are they just and reasonable? If competition does not exist, which I don't believe it does, if the marketplace is not yielding just and reasonable rates for an IP-based network, then regulators need to know what's going on with the costs and revenues. So I think that question that's up for debate, and I stand squarely on the side that a duopoly does not reflect adequate competition. I think regulators still should not let go of cost and revenue information during the transition to and when we arrive at the IP network.
Thanks, Ms. Baldwin. And now I'd like to recognize the Vice Chair for a question.
Yes, my question actually goes to the concerns about intercarrier compensation and USF reform. Why does separations come in third on that list? Why not second or first? Could you explain the hierarchy there and your thought process as to why we need to do the others first before we get back to separations, even though separations is probably the farthest along of all the three?
Mr. Smith?
With response to the question, in my opening statement, I referred to the fact that we should be doing it before, during, and after. So we certainly did not place it at third. We certainly placed it in an earlier position. So I've previously stated that I think it should be part of the process, at least concurrent with those other factors.
Mr. Boucher?
Sure. A couple of responses to that. One, I think the National Broadband Plan reflects a committed effort to dealing with intercarrier compensation reform and USF reform fairly soon, and so we're hopeful that will happen. I guess more directly to your question, I think I talked a little bit about this before, but until you know what intercarrier compensation reform is going to look like, what USF is going to look like, you don't know what separations you will need, rules you will need, if any, after that. There was a question about things like, do you need accurate, cost data for SLIC increases? We don't know until we know what the reform looks like, what kind of cost data is going to be needed. And from our perspective, it's not a productive exercise to try to be tinkering with sort of a narrow corner of the separations rules in the meantime. We think that it would entail a lot of potentially unnecessary work depending on where things come out.
Mrs. Scriven?
I'm not sure this will be responsive specifically, but I view separations as a very broad-based tool, and clearly I've said for certain carriers it may or may not be relevant anymore, but it's a very broad-based tool to establish jurisdiction by state and federal regulators over certain aspects of companies' operations, whereas intercarrier compensation is dealing with rates for reciprocal compensation, rates for state access services, rates for interstate access services, and in not all cases are those rates aligned or at the level the various industry partners think they need to be. So intercarrier compensation is dealing with specific rate changes where, in my opinion, separations is not. Similarly, universal service funding is dealing with enormous cash flows among carriers, and the way those are collected and the way those are distributed to carriers. And so it's dollar and cents right now, where again separations is more it more establishes at some point in time the authority of the regulators over carriers. And to the extent that rate making is not dependent on separations changes, then I don't think we need to address separations up front. I would say that as we look at some of the potential solutions to intercarrier compensation and universal service, which are tied together, it's possible that it may be concluded that there's a legal need to modify separations to allow for the implementation of a specific solution. So if that's the case, then that's sort of my exception to separations being changed, which is purely in reaction to a legal obligation to implement what we need to do for inter-carrier compensation and universal service.
Yes, Mr. Vice Chair.
Just to follow up, if we were to wait for inter-carrier compensation USF reform, would you feel comfortable including that in the broadband plan, or would you want the broadband plan to be completed and then talk about separations in, say, 2 or 3 years from now? Or it could be sooner, it could be later.
Well, I mean, that's a very broad question, the National Broadband Plan.
The reforms,
right.
yeah. Let me refine it.
You're right.
Yeah, as soon as the reforms are completed, is that when you think the separations is appropriate? I think Mr. Smith had actually said that it should be included. So are we having one conversation, or are we having 2 conversations?
Well, I think from the panel standpoint, at least the panel, the portion of the panel which is representing the industry, from the perspective of the industry segment, which believes it's already subject to competition for virtually all of its services, we don't believe separations reform will have an impact on that unless something's done essentially to cause us to lose revenue in one jurisdiction that we can't recover in the other. Then obviously we would not be favorable towards that happening. And so that's really our concern, is any from the standpoint of the companies which are large and publicly traded and believe that they are subject to market forces. Any change one way or the other is potentially destabilizing for us in terms of impacting our revenue flows. And that's something that, as I said, just would not be a welcome event.
Okay. I'm not sure if there are any commissioners on the telephone. If so, wanted to ask you if you had any questions at this time.
Actually, this is John Burke. I would have a question, if I could.
Commissioner, how are you?
This kind of rose from a couple of the Quest comments, and I was puzzled in a way because looking historically at how the freeze occurred, the theory was that the 5-year freeze that's almost 10 years old now would in fact give time for there to be a reform, in particular with inter-carrier compensation, that the 5 years should do it, and at the time the freeze was designed to approximate the traffic in the loop between intrastate and interstate. That 5 years went. The freeze has been extended forward because the reform that was just around the corner didn't occur in 5 years. It hasn't occurred in 10, and although we really believe it's maybe around the corner again, it still hasn't happened. And the one thing that troubled me about the comments is that at the time, 75-25, the ratio of jurisdictional percentages, was supposed to approximate the actual traffic in the loop as to the character. I don't think any of us think that that percentage even passes a straight face test today. Why should we be comfortable with that?
Mr. Boucher?
Commissioner Burke, this is Mr. Timothy Boucher again. I guess I hate to sound like a broken record, but I keep coming back to Quest's overall view of this, which is that the 75-25 allocator, like really all of the cost allocation rules, reflect a compromise. I mean, my understanding is that the history of that shows, I mean, that was a political compromise at the time, and sort of indicative of what I had referred to previously, that from an economic standpoint, it's not that you can determine a correct cost allocator. That was a compromise, like essentially so many, if not all, of the choices reflected in the sort of overall regulatory fabric, and so to look at that and focus on that and suggest that there is a correct answer and an ability to change that now to precisely track where we are exactly in the evolution of the underlying telecommunications network, we think rests on a false premise.
Well, at the time, though, there seemed to be an agreement that in the compromise, at least it made the hand grenade close type test. It doesn't make that anymore, does it? And why should we be comfortable since we know that that compromise now has changed dramatically from the circumstances when it was first arrived at?
Well, I guess I would just say I think that point is debatable still. I mean, it's a subjective viewpoint, and kind of again goes back to kind of whether you think there is a correct answer that can be reached. I think it is debatable whether or not I guess I put it. I would not say that it is clear that the 75-25% allocator is not reasonable.
You mean after Brand X and all of those decisions, you really think that still 3/4 of the traffic roughly is intrastate traffic? Is that your response?
Well, no, as I said, I think it goes back to just fundamentally our view of what the separations rules are seeking to accomplish, which is that loop allocator and all the cost allocations rules reflect a compromise, and still do.
Is it fair at least to say that just from a traffic perspective, things are dramatically different now than they were 10 years ago?
I would say that obviously the network has changed in the 10 years.
Thanks.
Any other commissioners? Staff, do you have any other questions?
Yes, I see between Tim and Mike sort of a paradox developing. At one point I hear you saying that separations is really not that important, that things are being market set and it's going to probably go away anyway. On the other hand, I hear some saying, don't make any changes. There's all this parade of horribles that could occur if we do something right now and upset the status quo. From the point of view of the consumers, from Sue, and from the point of view of the companies, could you indicate your litany of horribles that you believe could occur if either separations is either changed or not changed on an interim or a permanent basis?
I think there's a great disservice to consumers if the Commission does not act expeditiously to adopt at least an interim measure of reform, which is essential. There was reference to separations doesn't matter because there's no linkage to rates, yet a change in separations is an exogenous event and could well change the rates that are set. As I mentioned before, carriers' purported under-earnings at the state levels becomes a convenient excuse for failure to invest in outside plant, and the vast majority of consumers continue to rely on the basic local loop and therefore require that investment. As to, I think it would be an unwise policy to hold hostage these critical changes to intercarrier compensation and universal service fund reform in response to the concern that it's just a lot of work to do that, to do the separations, and maybe it's for naught. I think it wouldn't hurt if we've had a freeze for 9 years to resurrect the skills, the brain cells, the analysis necessary to look at costs and revenues. It's time to get this information out on the table, and it may well be a useful tool to the intercarrier compensation and USF debate. So rather than it being for naught, it would correct some inefficiencies now and may actually be useful as an analytic tool.
And I think I just have to keep coming back to what I think I've reiterated in the past. I mean, the problems with interim reform now are that it distracts from the important work of intercarrier comp and USF reform and other things that we would submit should be the priority of the Commission. It puts the cart before the horse. You can't know what it should look like until you know what those reforms look like. And in that respect, I mean, it's not just that it's a lot of work, but that it's not necessary and we're not ready. It in the meantime, promises or has the potential to increase compliance burdens, and then just fundamentally keep getting back to any type of interim reform just has inherent flaws in it, in that it does not recognize that the system itself is arbitrary and there are no correct answers, and these issues are debatable.
Yes, this is Mike. This is Mike Scriven with Fairpoint, and I want to build on what Tim just said. As I've said several times today, the allocation of common costs between state and interstate jurisdictions is inherently arbitrary. There's no right answer. If a cost is truly a common cost, then the usage or of minutes or packets going over that cannot, by any economic theory I've ever heard of, be rationally and explicitly said, well, this is interstate and this portion is intrastate. Common plant allocations are based on policy considerations. And for those companies who operate in areas that are subject to competition and believe that our rates are constrained by the market, then any jurisdictional shifts will have a negative impact on us. So that's our parade of concerns.
Mr. Smith?
Joel, we enjoy your turn of phrase, litany of horribles. I'll give you perhaps just one example of that litany. If we get to the end of a process, if we ignore some of the changes that need to at least be debated now, we could get to the end of the process and either under a scenario where we change the jurisdictional bucket totals later, or we left it to the question you had, I believe it might have been number 6, about leaving it to the states to make individual changes and we could shift some dollars. The result of that change could be a state shifting dollars back to interstate, and the FCC then perhaps doesn't have a plan with respect to recovering that through rate structure. It would be unfortunate from a policy perspective if we don't devote the time to looking at what some of those possible shifts could be while we're making some of these other changes. Now, I did want to talk to, with all due respect to Mr. Boucher, I wanted to say something to him on the break before I said this here in front of the microphone. I assured him that after his company is done being acquired, he will have some more time to deal with these things. So it's something that we and I'll go back to what Susan said, just because it's difficult does not mean we don't have to do it. There's certainly enough to do in any of these areas, but we're at a very challenging time in the industry, and it's incumbent upon everyone to step up to what needs to be done to get a good public policy result, not only in 2010, 2011, but in 2015 and 2020.
This is Roger Nishi. When you look at the overall settlement process, it's if you push on any one button, it does cause different changes throughout. So things that are suggested here, I think people really need to think about them as we go through looking at intercarrier compensation and universal service in the national broadband plan. So what we're discussing here, I wouldn't say it be implemented before then, but what we're talking about here could help influence the decisions that are made there. I mean, over time, if the FCC, for at least Title II companies, says that DSL continues to be regulated, over time, I would say that maybe more of the loop does need to come back to the interstate jurisdiction. But those are discussions we're going to have, and if it does push more to the interstate jurisdiction, will broadband become unaffordable in our areas? And at that point, we need to discuss funding mechanisms to make sure rates are reasonable and affordable for the rural areas. So there's a whole lot that comes into play, and like I said, if you push one button, it's going to impact another area. So we need to keep the discussions going on all the areas with separations and how it may impact intercarrier comp and universal service in the national broadband plan.
Okay, as we wind down, Daniel or Joe, do you have any other questions?
One more, if I may.
A few.
Can you please give us your sense of the time required to implement the state member's proposal for interim reform and include in that estimate not only time to get software and computer systems operational, but any clarification of FCC rules that might also be required?
Unfortunately, I think what could be done, I believe it could easily be implemented before the next separations freeze expires in June of 2011. However, if industry were directed to implement it, they don't have an incentive to move the process along quickly, because we've heard that they think it shouldn't be adopted. So I'm very concerned about the dependence on industry's cooperation in order to implement the proposal. And it may be that the joint board would need to have some technical sessions held, some workshops to move things along quickly, and to make sure that problems don't pop up in May. Oh, we can't possibly implement it because of ABC, but to know those ABCs back now, starting right away.
Thank you. Mr. Boucher?
Again, Quest is in a little bit of a different position because of forbearance, but I think that as others have made clear, I know AT&T filed an extensive filing talking about the difficulty of, from an administrative perspective, of implementing the state members' proposal. I'm just focusing on the local loop. The loop proposal, the suggestion is to create 8 new categories of loops that need to be, where loops will be categorized on a loop-by-loop basis, requiring incredibly complicated billing systems. And so I wouldn't even attempt to give you, just off the top of my head, an accurate estimate of the cost or time for something like that, but I think it's pretty substantial.
This is Mike Scriven with Fairpoint. I think the short answer is I really don't know. I don't know whether our systems can currently produce some or all of this information, or if, assuming they can't, what it would take to modify those systems. And certainly our people working on systems would like to be working on issues such as billing systems and other changes, which we would consider more important and more relevant to operating our business than to be have this priority put upon them.
Thank you. Mr. Smith?
Dan, that's a difficult question to answer in terms of the time frame. It's certainly likely years more than months, but in order to make a determination with respect to your specific item and how long would it would take to change the mechanized systems, we'd really need to see the draft set of rules in order to do that. If you add one new subcategory, it's one thing. If you add 8, that's something different. It depends upon the amount of time you want to have for a comment and reply and data gathering process. There's a lot of factors there in play, but it's certainly going to take a period of time, and probably you measure that in terms of years instead of months, but we'd have to see some more of the specifics before we could give you a definitive answer.
Mr. Askoff?
Yeah, and obviously we can't say with any specificity what the time would be to implement it. Our comments did highlight a number of the practical concerns with Part 2 of the state members' proposals. A lot of kind of difficulties in determining which loops should be assigned to which particular one of those subcategories, particularly as those services are changing rapidly. I tend to agree with Jeff that in terms of seeing actual rules, commenting upon them, putting them, you'd have to go through the process of a recommendation, a rulemaking, comments or replies on both sets of things. All of that is time that we could be spending thinking about what separations is going to look like in a broadband world, which I think we'd rather do. So it would take a while, a couple of years probably. I'm not sure that it would be time well spent, with all due respect.
Thank you, Exactly. Before we wind down, I'm sorry, Joel?
I hear many of you saying that the separations process is inherently arbitrary. But at the same time, I hear some of you saying that and agreeing that the use to which plan is put is changing, and whether or not costs are incurred on a minute of use basis is changing. Do you believe that there is a time when the existing separations process will just become too arbitrary? It's not just arbitrary, but too outdated arbitrary, that it has to be replaced? So can it be sustained legally forever at a frozen factor and category?
This is Eric from California. I think we're actually at that point.
I don't think that is something that's later to happen. I think we have reached the point where the current separations factors are no longer appropriate. They are completely arbitrary, and I think that one of the chairpersons actually spoke to that earlier, trying to get a response from Quest, that the minutes of use or how the services are actually being used, how facilities are being used, it does not align at all with the arbitrary 75-25 split, and I think that goes for not just that split, for many other aspects of separation.
This is Chris White. I would note that what Quest said about protecting revenue streams, that sounds a lot like what one would expect in a regulated environment, not what one would say if they really believe the market was competitive. And this whole discussion at this point about how long it would take and how onerous this would be sounds more like pleas from people who should be regulated, not people who should be saying that the services are competitive.
Mr. Burchett?
My opinion is that as long as there's two bodies of regulators regulating our company's business, there has to be some methodology for assigning jurisdictional responsibility. And if that becomes totally arbitrary and becomes totally political compromise, that's what it is. But somehow the costs have to be assigned to a jurisdiction as long as two bodies have jurisdiction over the rates.
Thank you. And in a couple of minutes, anyone else on the telephone, do you have any question that could be answered or asked in a quick form?
Just a quick comment, if I could, Madam Chairman. This is John Burke. I just want to say that the argument about time not well spent and years, honestly, that's exactly the same argument that was made at the end of the first freeze 5 years ago, that it would take 2 or 3 years, and why should we bother doing it, and we're 5 years later. And I think that's a fair comment, and it ought to be made.
Thank you. Anyone else on the phone?
This is Eric from California again. I just had a quick question that I had brought up earlier. There was discussion about minutes of use no longer being appropriate, and I was curious if anyone had some ideas about what other indicators could be used aside from minutes of use. I mean, this can be just off the top. It doesn't have to be very specific, but what are some other indicators that could actually be used?
Anyone? Susan? No.
Well, I think in terms of the local loop, the indicator is the state member's proposal, which is what's used for voice, what's used for data, what's used for a blend, what's used for video.
Anyone else? Well, at this point, we have a few minutes left. Want to give in true debate style, give you a couple, about 90 seconds maybe, for closing statements, and just because I feel like that, I'll start with Roger and then go back down, or Richard.
I want to thank you for the time today, and I'll just reiterate that we have a lot on our plates today, and I do believe that we need to take everything that has been discussed here and really look at how that will interact with the intercarrier compensation and universal service as part of the National Broadband Plan. I don't see a need to implement something in the interim and then go into a transition to another plan. Let's figure out how to implement what's discussed here in the National Broadband Plan, create a transition, and get to that.
Thank you. Richard, anything to add?
I would second what Roger says.
Great. Mr. Burchett and Mrs. Smith?
We echo Roger's comments with respect, appreciating the opportunity to dialogue with everyone here today. There have been a lot of good views expressed, certainly some different views on some of these issues, and we encourage the Joint Board and the Commission to look carefully at these things and understand the impacts. A couple of closing comments. One, we need to keep in mind in some of these rural high cost to serve areas, it's important to continue to be able to build networks and maintain those networks. And when sometimes I hear people refer to this new broadband network, and at least in a lot of rural areas, it's the same network. We're not constructing a new network. We're putting different uses over that network. And it's important to remember that if we're going to have a national broadband plan, we need to be able to have service out in those rural, high-cost-to-serve areas. And from our perspective, we think that jurisdictional separations is going to continue to play a role in that with respect to what Ken said in response to that previous question. As long as we have a dual means of jurisdiction, as long as we have inter- and intrastate regulation, we need some way to, whether it's arbitrary, by any definition, we need some way to allocate those costs. So again, we thank you for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you. Mrs. Scriven?
Yes, I too want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this. I've enjoyed it. People don't always believe me when I say that, but I have enjoyed it, and I don't have anything to add to my comments.
Thank you. Mr. Boucher?
I too would just say thank you for allowing me to be here today and share some thoughts and just, I guess, sum up I won't reiterate all our rationale from across the debate, but all said, we think that the freeze still serves the right balance at this point in time, particularly given what we hope will be quick work on intercarrier comp and USF reform.
Mr. White?
I would say that it's time for change. It's been delayed too long, and we need to get on with the process, and we should do it before the expiration of the next freeze runs out.
Thank you. Mr. Van Wombeck?
Yes, I would agree, too, that the time is now. It's not sometime 2 or 3 years later. And as it's been iterated before, the freeze has been pushed and pushed again. We're at a point where it's totally arbitrary now, and we need some resolution to that. I also would like to respond to the NECA closing comments that I agree, too, that the small companies are in a situation where they need to know how they're going to be recovered, and there needs to be some separation factor that they can rely on. The problem is it shouldn't be the wrong factor. It shouldn't be something that is so arbitrary that it's irrelevant. Even if it is somewhat arbitrary, that would be an improvement. And my last is that I also wanted to say thank you, but can we please make the call next time later than 9 o'clock?
Thank you. I did apologize at the time. You might not have been awake yet. Thank you, and we really do appreciate you getting up. What time was that? 6.
I was here at 5:30 for the 6 o'clock call. It was brutal.
Well, I'll put in a word for you with the president. I'll let him know to.
All right, thank you.
Okay, and Ms. Baldwin.
Thank you. I too have enjoyed the opportunity and appreciate the opportunity to participate today. And I echo the comments of Chris and Eric that it's time for timely reform, and let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good.
Thank you. Mr. Vice Chair?
I just want to say quickly thank you to all of you. I feel like we're holding a box, and some people want us to put the box down and deal with 2 other boxes and put those away first. But it's a sticky situation, and to all parties involved, I very much appreciate you taking the time to write your briefs, to come to Washington to explain your case, and we will do the best that we can to take all the comments, put them together, and hopefully come out with the best decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Again, I would like to thank everyone responsible for seeing that this exchange was possible. Staff, all of you. I think oftentimes people do not realize what goes into a decision. You know, the decisions that we render at the agency or most other regulatory agencies, that a lot goes into it, that indeed is not arbitrary, that there are a lot of things to be weighed. And I thank you all for giving, for the last almost 3 hours, giving the public just a little snapshot of what goes into all of these very significant decisions that are made. Again, if you want to see a rebroadcast, go on fcc.gov. I know it's so exciting until you would have to see it again. And also, I'd like to acknowledge in support of Commissioner Colbeck as Brad Ramsey, who's been quiet today, so that's newsworthy, believe it or not. The General Counsel of NARUC. So I just wanted to acknowledge his presence today, and you just saw from the snapshot that he needs a haircut. But anyway, that's another story for another time. Again, seriously, thank all of you, and until next time. Good evening.
Thank you.